So, Rocio Lopez, thank you very much for being here. The paper is Fascism as Bourgeois Reaction. Rocio Lopez is a writer for the International Marxist Humanist Journal. I read it all the time. Thank you very much. And a member of the Transnational Solidarity Network. In Escape from Reflexivity, Fromm and Giddens on Individualism, Anxiety, and Authoritarianism, Charles Ford, interprets the widespread support for Donald Trump among white US Americans as a combination of self-surrender and racist sadomasochism. Looking back, we must understand the roots of Trumpism. Marcuse once described Nazi Germany as a, quote, cheap gangster melodrama, end quote, a characterization that could equally be applied to Trump's administration. Still, this does not explain the deep emotional bond between the disgraced former president and the 75 million US Americans who voted to re-elect him. In this presentation, Rocio will consider Trumpism and fascism as a reactionary middle-class phenomenon. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Hope you are well. Hope you can hear me. Okay. So I want to start off by talking, I'll just mention, I don't know a lot of Marcuse. The interest for this talk was doing a book club, reading a book about Fromm. It was called Erich Fromm's Critical Theory. Anyway, we'll begin. So I'll be focusing on what Fromm said about the middle class's susceptibility to fascism. So first, I want to clear up some facts about who Trump voters are. The base of Donald Trump's authoritarian movement is the middle class, or the middle income people. The median income of Trump primary and general election voters in 2016 and 2020 was much higher than the median income of either Clinton or Biden voters, or Americans overall, whether they voted or not. So the median income of a Trump primary voter in 2016 was actually $72,000, far above, the median income in general. And as we can see, this last couple months, as we've seen these last couple months, the profiles of those indicted for their participation in the January 6th insurrection serve as a good reminder that Trump voters are hardly all, or even mostly, salt of the earth types. We've seen lawyers, real estate agents, police officers have been indicted for their participation in that coup attempt. And I just wanted to first start off with the popular narrative that Trump voters were disproportionately poor whites really doesn't have that much data behind it. White voters without a college degree making less than the median income made up only 25% of Trump's 2016 general election voters. In fact, 2/3 of Trump voters in the 2016 general election made above the median income. So let me repeat that. 2/3 of Trump voters in the 2016 general election made above the median income, so the top half. So they're disproportionately upper, middle class. So what is behind this? Why, if there was a lot of talk of economic anxiety, why would, people who are doing well be the ones who are, wanting to overthrow society in a bad direction, or overthrow the government? Well, actually, I guess to maintain Trump's in power, but, overthrow democracy. When they are not actually personally suffering necessarily. So Fromm has some explanation of what is going on here and why the middle class is particularly susceptible to being authoritarian in their personality traits. It's very simple. They have something to lose. Obviously, the capitalist class, which is about them, obviously they have their interest in maintaining capitalism, but the middle class, here I'm going to define the middle class like being the petite bourgeoisie, but also the upper income parts of the working class, like the top fifth of the working class. Even though they're proletariat, they might not have that identity as a proletariat. So their identity depends on what they have, which is not much compared to, what 1% has, but they have something: property, houses, savings. So they've seen what's been going on with neoliberalism the last few decades. And what's interesting, what I've noticed, is the more precarious working class has to find other bases for their identity, since they have to rely more on their circles and collectivity for just basic survival. Since the like precarious working class have very little, actually, they don't really have a lot of property, they don't have a lot of income, they don't have a lot of savings, they're not super invested in society as much as the middle class. They are more likely to know that the basis of their self-worth and identity is more than what they do not have. For example, my most recent job was working in a call center, and my identity does not depend on, my self-worth does not depend on like having a shitty job, as most of the proletariat that I know, you know, that have, they work at 7-Eleven, whatever, security guards, that's not the basis of like who they are, unlike the middle class who might identify with their particular line of work. So Charles Thorpe summarized Fromm's argument pretty well as, quote, "The threat of having nothing is the threat of being nothing. It is those that have gained some crumbs in the capital system who are most anxious about maintaining their status." So Fromm says in To Have or To Be, really succinctly, if I am what I have, and if what I have is lost, who then am I? Nobody but a defeated, deflated, pathetic testimony to a wrong way of living. Because I can lose what I have, I am necessarily constantly worried that I shall lose what I have. And okay, I am afraid of thieves, of economic changes, of revolutions, of sickness, of death, and I am afraid of love, of freedom, of growth, of change, of the unknown. I have become defensive, hard, suspicious, lonely, driven by the need to have more in order to be better protected. So that, to me, that, you know, that really succinctly summarizes like the authoritarian middle class personality, you know, what they have to gain by it. So just the standard account of like what Marxists generally say about, you know, this middle class affinity of being the base of reaction in like fascism. So obviously I mentioned the petit bourgeoisie, they're independent producers between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, but they identify with neither necessarily or both, but they do not necessarily see the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, as a source of their problems. They see the proletariat as much of a threat to what they do have as they see them as a potential ally. And as I mentioned before, it's not just the petit bourgeoisie that like are self-employed who necessarily identify this way. A lot of high earning skilled workers, like, I don't know, like tech workers or something, may identify that way also. These groups do not have themselves have economic problems to feel threatened by the increased precariousness of life they see happening to the working class under the last few decades of neoliberalism. Now, according to Fromm, people under capitalism have existential anxiety due to their separateness from nature. Obviously, Marx would say that, I mean, he also noted that separation from nature, but Marx would say this alienation, this basic anxiety is due to alienation from being separated from the means of production and having nothing but their labor. Now, Fromm argues that the authoritarian personality wants to escape from freedom, and pretty simply turns to a father figure who overcomes the complexity of modernity and all its choices. Like I said, I don't know much about Marcuse, but I know that Fromm rejected Freudian psychoanalysis' emphasis on sexuality, unlike Marcuse. Now, one connection between Marcuse and Fromm that I found was that they thought Marx's 1844 manuscripts were very important. So this was like the Young Marx. This wasn't published in English until the early 20th century. Like very important figures like Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin did not have access to that when they were, you know, developing their interpretation of Marxism. So the 44 manuscripts, what they're important to know is that they concern Marxist theory of alienation as central to capitalism, which really differs from Marxist-Leninism's argument that capitalism is generally a problem of distribution. Marx in those manuscripts argued that the state controlling property would not fix one of the core problems of capitalism, which was alienation and not just private property. And that, you know, Marcuse and Fromm agreeing on this was quite in contrast to Althusser's rejection of this importance of the Young Marx in the 1844 manuscripts. Now, I want to tie this back to Marcuse, Marcuse, because I mentioned like what Fromm had to say really explained, you know, why this is a disproportionate middle class like basis for fascist movements. But Marcuse thought the U.S. working class was not necessarily going to be the revolutionary agent, to destroy capitalism or overturn it, unlike youth or the most marginalized, like a little bit proletariat. But as we can see, actually, even with the data that we have, it's not necessarily the working class, even the white working class, that is the social base for mass authoritarian Trumpism. I would love to hear what the Marcusean scholars think of like what is behind this, because I don't know much about Marcuse. Just one last thing I wanted to note. I have not read Eros and Revolution, but a key part of the Trumpist movement is, or a part of the appeal is sexual aggression, as Javier noted. And Marcuse would certainly have something to say about that. I don't know, I'm just speculating here what he said, but the middle class is perhaps the most conformist segment of capitalist society because of their social roles. I mean, their roles in production. And clearly Trump has offered those who are ultra conformist an outlet for their sexual aggression and frustrations. So that's all I have to say for now. Thank you so much for coming here.